Hi everyone. My name's Ali Gumillya Baker, and today we're going to be talking to the deadly Dr Paola Balla, and we're here for the FUMA, Flinders University Museum of Art, public talk, and the series is called Talking Art and Ideas. And we're just going to be in conversation talking about the current exhibition, which is on at FUMA, called Sovereign Sisters Domestic Work, which is on until April 2022. Amazing. Time flies. And this show, we'll talk a little bit about it, but in particular, we'll talk about Paola's deadly work in the show, and I guess about some of the ideas behind the show. But before we go any further, I just want to acknowledge that I'm talking to you today from beautiful Ghana Yata. I'm in the kind of hills, the foothills at the foot of Nanu, and we look out over the Adelaide Plains here, beautiful Ghana country, and I've grown up on Ghana country, but my family are from the west coast of South Australia. We're Merning from the Nullarbor, and I'll get beautiful Paola to introduce herself. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on beautiful Kulin Nations country, and in particular the homelands of the Bunurong and Woiwurrung Wurundjeri peoples, and in downtown Footscray, which is like in the western suburbs of Melbourne and not that far from the city. And my homelands that I haven't got to see for a long time because of lockdown, but I've gotten close to them recently, are the Wemba matriarchal homelands of my mother's people. And I want to acknowledge my Gunditj Mara, our patrilineal line, my great-grandfather's country, which is beautiful ocean country. And I'm missing both and looking forward to seeing them really soon. But yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Paola. So the exhibition Sovereign Sisters Domestic Work is part of Tarnandy Festival of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Art, Contemporary Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Art, which is on in Ghana country and across South Australia at the moment. And this show is a sister show to a show that was on at Vital Statistics, curated by Dr Natalie Harkin, called Apron, Sorrow, Sovereignty, which is the culmination of a project that Natalie has been engaged with, an ARC project looking at Aboriginal women's labour histories of South Australia, which has been largely kind of, the history of it hasn't really been researched at all in South Australia, and a lot of the records haven't even been kind of accessed or opened. But there's a huge and really extensive history of Aboriginal women into forced domestic servitude by protector-run policies. But obviously, well, not obviously, this is a national story, and I guess this exhibition, Sovereign Sisters Domestic Work, really honours the incredible Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander artists nationally who talk about these stories from within our own families and communities, and I guess talks about the role also of artists in pushing these histories to the forefront of the conversations that need to be had in this country around ideas of justice. So I'm really honoured to talk to you today, Paola. I've, really greatly admire your work, and I'm looking forward to hearing about the piece that you have in the show, but I guess also hearing about more broadly about your work and your research. But yeah, I just want to, I guess, also acknowledge that what we're talking about today, they're very personal stories, but they're also shared collective stories that are not broadly understood by the broader non-Indigenous community. And maybe, you know, I know that you're also an educator, Paola, and so I guess we share that as well, being both artists and academics. And I know from my experience that a lot of the stories of Aboriginal people's indentured labour and slavery has not really been kind of broadly understood in the community, and perhaps you would like to reflect on that or talk to that.
Well, thank you so much. You know, I adore speaking with you, and you know, I definitely feel that you know, you're definitely a sovereign sister of mine, and really was absolutely thrilled and really honoured to be included in this show. Firstly, you know, just to honour that invitation, and I think a feeling of exchange that we have, you know, between the work we're doing in our communities, like across, you know, this colonial border that's there between, you know, what's known as Vic and South Australia. So there's that, and the way it responds to those archives, you know, of those states. But there's also, I don't know, that connection between countries and songlines, and I think that we're probably tapping into something. My grandmother, Rosie Tang, always talked to me about how we'd get, you know, she'd always say, oh, that, you know, we're going to get that Adelaide weather. You always look to those fellas because that's our climate. And it always makes me think about this thing of invitation and movement and, you know, all those things that supersede and are sovereign and transcend these colonial borders. So I really honour that, you know, the leadership and the sovereignty of honouring sisterhood in art and community and the academic work, and especially everything you do and everything Unbound Collective does just blows me away. So I'm in awe. And the artists in this show are the people I grew up looking up to, getting, you know, towards 50 myself, but to be in a show with such a phenomenal, oh my gosh, yeah, I could go on and on about everyone's work in this show and the artists, but, you know, I don't want to leave anyone out, but even just to be in a show with Destiny Deacon, who was, you know, my first tutor at Melbourne Uni when I was 18 and fresh down from Yorta Yorta country, down from the bush, to be learning from her as a very, very young person, very green, and to come full circle to be in a show with Destiny is an honour, let alone everybody else in it. It's incredible. Just blows me away. But to all, I think, to be contributing to creating awareness about these stories. And I don't know, as an educator, I'm being a big old hypocrite, because I get frustrated at times that our work as artists and curators has to be educational. It's frustrating because that doesn't happen with, you know, white people's art, with Gabbar's art. But here we are. You know, we're politicized people and we're political people, and we have to be in order to resist and fight colonialism. But yeah, I think that I am committed to education, though, as much as I get frustrated with it. You know, no wonder how much difference we're making. But these stories absolutely have to be told. And like you said, there is the personal and the political merging here. So many of us are carrying that this is our mum, nan, aunties, or great grandmother's actual lived experience that we carry. And for me, definitely the work I put in this show was an existing work, because a lot of my work has been focused on honouring the matriarchal lives in my life, and whether they're still with me or with us or gone, the strength of the stories that gets told about them is so powerful that I always felt like my great-grandmother and great-great-grandmother are with me. Anyway, and to know the stories of how they had to endure servitude and slave labour wages in this state as Aboriginal women, it just always astonished me. And I think as I become, an older adult and really think about what that meant, if I can, sort of present some of those stories in my art and academic work, then I feel like somehow I'm making sure they're not forgotten and that people do know this. And you and I have spoken a few times. I get very frustrated and angry at white feminism's just complete lack of acknowledgement of the use of Aboriginal women's bodies as a, as tools and as sites of violence and as their labour force. And I think they forget that the colonial project wasn't a, solely male one. So there's a lot that needs to be uncovered that's really uncomfortable for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And it's that whole capacity of the kind of ways in which those histories are understood and emerge is also really important. And I feel as though we've, for so, like as educators as well, and working in academia, where it's taken our communities a really long time to have space within these educational institutions, these kinds of the way we want to tell our story and the ways in which those stories are connected and our interconnectedness. And I love the way you talked about the wind and the weather, Paola.
Yeah, sorry, I've got alerts going off for my family and my work right now. Sorry. Yeah, I think that I just think honouring those histories, there's something about it that it's like reckoning with grief as well.
Yeah.
And shame, because I just know, like in myself, I need to be very careful, like how I do this honouring without, I don't know, an auntie of mine once, and she became a really hard woman because of the things that she went through. She became really very tough. People describe her as tough. But I remember her saying to me once, must never, ever romanticize ourselves. And I just thought, God, that's just such a powerful thing to say, because I see it swirling a lot around now, particularly around on social media, the impact of that toxic positivity about trying to be a successful blackfella or trying to overcome through an idea of success that somehow is tied up with capitalism and, that old pressure that white people would assert on. And growing up in a country town, I know this very well. Their attitudes were that if you behave like white people, they might accept you. There's no guarantee of that. But if you behave like a white person, that was how they would speak about you. So you would be, good for an abo or not bad for an abo. And Black women's bodies were to be used in the dark, after dark, in secret, so it's that very ugly, blatant, absolutely blatant and insidious racism that was about, there was only one place we were ever going to fit. And for men, it would be on the football field if they were exceptional, but they still weren't as welcome like in the club rooms or in the social world, but it was one way. Whereas for women, there was virtually no way to be acceptable to white people, so, and I was never interested in that anyway. My mum and matriarchs taught me to just row with them and fight with them anyway. Yeah. But that, that pressure that I think sometimes comes through in very curated success stories about places blackfellas can go, and that culture of firsting people to be the first to do something. And I think there's just a danger in that. And that danger also becomes about erasing the very ugly realities, the harsh realities of what our women went through in how their bodies were used for that labor. And so there was kind of no way to be an acceptable Black woman other than to behave yourself, maybe be a good housekeeper, be a good worker on a property, but you're still spoken about in those derogatory terms. And I think coming to terms with that as a young age, that they will never accept you as the same or as good as another white person, that really empowered me, actually being very aware of how deep their hatred for Blackfellas goes.
Yeah.
And I know that sounds really bleak and nihilistic to some people, but that's how we survived, by being very aware of how they thought about us.
Yeah.
And
it's that kind of sense of like, if that feeling is, am I imagining that they're thinking these things, or are they really thinking these things? That particular, and you know that you get the feeling that people have a particular attitude, and it's also around ideas of progress and around ideas of it's that social Darwinism that they've internalized to the point where that you can tell that they've really internalized those racialized ideas about them being fundamentally better.
Yeah, and in a country town where there were people, like there were some people coming off farms, and then there's country people in town, right?
Yeah.
We knew, as Black kids and as Black community, we knew where we stood with these people.
Yeah.
We understood their attitudes towards us very intimately. There were no illusions about that. And whenever I saw anyone slipping into that, I actually felt wild at them, but I also kind of felt sorry for them, because I was like, they're never going to accept you. And there were families that were Black but pretended to be Indian or other cultures to survive either the stolen generation, the welfare officers, and so on.
Yeah.
But you see these like different these live realities of Blackness in those kind of towns. And when you're walking around with the grandchildren of the people that so-called employed, barely paid your grandmother, and your aunties and your mother, that's how you know them. You know them through their lineage. Their lineage is that they inherit this hatred and racism towards us, and this over familiarity that they think they know us because our people have worked on their properties, or our nans worked in their houses.
Yeah.
And so that's their point of reference. And we're either that, or we're marginalized to the point that we're only seen as a drunk or a slut. So what's happening now kind of fascinates me. Like when I go home or observe my hometown and community, how a newer awareness is actually impacting these histories, and how comfortable people become at either then talking about it or kind of riding roughshod over it and saying, well, we're in a new era now, things are better because this and this is happening. So it's almost like sometimes people are celebrating, the very public, the most sort of tip of the mountain stuff, like AFL celebrations of Blackness.
Yeah. But when it thing, it can be a performative thing, and it's also like that sense of like not wanting to air your dirty laundry, and in some ways, when you first started talking, it is that really careful. Like my nan and aunties used to talk about it like putting on airs and graces.
Yeah.
Some people are, putting on airs and graces, and they're just not being honest. So on a fundamental level, not being honest about your kind of roots, which is that we know that we were told we were rubbish people. And, we were told that there would be that everything about who we were. I mean, the Protector of Aborigines on the West Coast wrote things like the only good half caste is a dead one. And my nan knew that growing up as a child, to stay away from that woman because she was dangerous. But more than dangerous, she would threaten her life on some very fundamental level. You know what I mean? Like, it's really, if you spoke up, you would be killed. It was a really violent place. at the turn of the century where my nana grew up. And
Yeah.
I feel as though that the cusp of violence in our communities is always there.
Yeah.
That sense of your body can become the point at which the flesh and the law meet is your body.
Yes.
And that you will be expelled.
Yes.
So, but then there's levels of acceptance or understanding around that kind of violence of your history, but also the intense violence of those ideas of racism, of social Darwinism, of hierarchical, you come from savages and you never deserved this land in the first place. You were never using it. You didn't make good use of it and you didn't deserve it.
Yeah, it didn't deserve it. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that feeds these attitudes of the lack of care and indifference for the impact on Aboriginal women's bodies in particular around service to not only to service white homes and properties and that labouring really hard physical work, but the service to community then as well, like the exhausting work of holding family and mob together when you've moved off the mission and into town, which is what my great-grandparents did going into Echuca from 1941. And they left in protest at how the mission manager was treating them. And the mission manager's wife, along with the mission manager walking around with a gun on his shoulder inspecting the homes, she would go in with a white glove, and check for dust in the little mission houses. So they were under that level of observation. The church that was there previously was more passive in how they managed the mission. So they felt that at least they had a sense of autonomy. They had a beautiful little church house, a schoolhouse, gardens. They were making their own mud bricks. Moonakala Mission was really successful for what they were able to do, considering that they'd been, pushed onto a particular part of our own homelands and were restricted to that place. But once the mission managers were appointed by the government and the church was gone, my grandparents with their 10 kids were like, no, we're out. We're not going to put up with this. So going into town then meant renegotiating, like what kind of work could they get? How could they be employed? How could they earn money to feed the family? And sort of set up, they were one of the first Aboriginal families are allowed to buy a home in that part of Echuca, and it was on where the Campaspe and the Murray rivers would actually flood, and it's just behind the cemetery and the police house and the courthouse. So it was this strange triangle. It is still there. Family still lives there. My auntie lives there, my mum's first cousin. So one of the granddaughters is still there at that place, and it became a meeting place for all other community members. And this is where a lot of these stories would get told. And it was the visiting place. So as a child, that's where I was taken constantly by mum for catch-ups, visits, feed, to watch TV. Mum, they didn't have a television. There was one TV in the whole community and the family. So, these types of homes where that auntie holds it all together. And so she's holding all of that together, as well as working for white people who treat her like shit. And she has to constantly negotiate like how to deal with them.
Yeah.
And also maybe get jobs like she did for my grandmother, negotiate with them to get her, while she's leaving a relationship with little kids coming out of the bush with no electricity and that, being chased by welfare, coming into town. So their whole lives are monitored. And there's all this negotiation going on that these, really staunch matriarchs were able to hold space and do that for each other. So I just think that level of labour isn't really documented, and that's like in my PhD research, that's why I wanted to include chapters on that work, on those stories, that it be recognised as labour. Because, there are so many Aboriginal people in this country who's, there's so many amazing stories that are documented, but there's so many women's stories that aren't. And that's what I kept finding in my research, like what's not told about our matriarchs.
Yeah, beautiful. So I've just flipped through the couple of slides. So sorry, we got talking straight away. I feel like I've been on
sorry
for so long, because there's so many parallels, I think, with how I feel listening to you talking about your nan and your aunties and the matriarchs in your family, and I guess the level of strength. But this exhibition, your work, beautiful work here, Born into Sovereignty, Live in Sovereignty. 2014, is that right?
Yeah.
And this is when I first met you, Paola, this work was on at an exhibition at Tandanya.
Oh,
and
yes,
I remember the day. I remember meeting you in the gallery, and you felt so familiar. I've got
have you still got that catalogue? Yeah, I called it Kalinda Yarnyans, which means to love your sisters in our Wemba language. So that's so it's just really beautiful that it's like returned. So again, I feel like there's some ties there, some connections, and I love that, I've really honoured you and Maddie, invited me into this show and sort of returned it there, because that work was it was actually meant to be something else and it didn't work. And I kept, when you're working on a work and you have a vision in your mind and you've got that concept swirling around for months, and I was writing about it and doing little experiments and trying to make it work, and it didn't work. It was actually meant to be a kite. And I was trying to grapple with my nan's story and all of my matriarch's story and mum's. So it's not just that hard physical labour they did as domestics. Also, my mum was a drover's cook, so was my great-grandmother. My great-great-grandmother, Papa, was a midwife. She went around in a horse and cart to all of the district around Moonacalla and Tadelequin and the Riverina of New South, what's known as New South. And so they all did that hard kind of labouring work. But we also, each generation of us have experienced rape and sexual assault, and so I was grappling with that work and trying to heal and deal with the impacts of that as a trauma illness and how it was manifesting, and not just in me, but in my family. And also mindful that, in talking about that trauma work, that transgenerational trauma, that also remind white people that, yes, while we might inherit transgenerational trauma in various ways, you continue to practice transgenerational racism and violence upon us. So don't ever fix our trauma that it's somehow inherent and that we're somehow inherently sick, traumatized people because of the past. It's like, no, we're in this continuum of violence that we're contending with from the settler state. It continues. It hasn't ended. So, and I see that happen to our women and kids through child removal and the incarceration of Aboriginal women. It's all an attack on our bodies. So that work I was really trying to figure out, how do I say these things without being explicit? And I know, Professor Chelsea Watergoes talked about this recently. She highlighted how Fiona Foley's work in her Biting the Clouds beautiful book, she speaks about that she didn't want to recreate trauma when she speaks of it. And I didn't have the words for that at the time, but I was just grappling with, how do I say these things without explicitly going into it, and also respecting that I can't give away all of my elders and matriarchs' details and stories that they had so much shame about they couldn't even speak about. So it's not my place to tell each one of those stories, but I was trying to visualize the impact of it. I was trying to create like a marker that if other Black women in my family or community saw it, they could start to think and have a yarn with us privately about it, but not necessarily just put it out there for white people to consume. Do you know what I mean? It's like, it's really hard because you want to create awareness, but at the same time protect it. So that's why I have the feathers on there in the house dress. So it's a 1950s house dress, and it's very much like the one my nan was wearing in a photograph. One of the only two photos we have of her as a young woman, and she's wearing this beautiful house dress, and she's out with her sister Auntie Markie and their cousin Auntie Nellie Green, and they're at their show in Echuca in the early mid 1940s. and they look so beautiful, and they've got little handbags on their arms. And I was just thinking about the effort they would have gone to, and the nervousness, and also in the shame and fear of going out. Like my nan was like that. She would get really shamed to go out and be around amongst a heap of white people. There's a nervousness that comes up too about what you're going to have to endure. Think about things before they happen, like that hypervigilance of being in a white space. So that I just really, really thought about that image and her life and how I knew her. And I was only 19 when she passed away, so I didn't have a lot of time with Nan, but we were super close. And I would just sponge up everything she said and did, because, half the time I was sleeping in her bed if I wasn't at mum's, and we moved around a lot. So she was very influential to me. And the feathers are that in Wemba culture, we're predominantly bird people, particularly our women. So, and Nan had given me her grandmother's totem, the willy wagtail, or Karatichuk, we say. And so some of my aunties were helping me recover from a mental illness breakdown that I had. And so they were sending me things. They sent me bush medicine through my mum, and emu feathers collected up home on country. And I thought, how do I honour these feathers? And them reaching out to me through this gift giving and exchanging. It came all in this beautiful basket. And so I sewed them into the hem of the dress. And the other feathers were collected by friends, a couple of elders, and people that knew a bit about my work. So I sort of trusted them. And then, it was just a matter of sort of cleaning the feathers and thinking about where they were placed. And also every single bird on it has a meaning. So they were really carefully placed. And I guess I just wanted to create a work that looked like it was about, yes, we very much know this violence, and we know what it feels like to be tethered and monitored, but it's also that power to dream and what it feels like to be connected to each other and country, and to remember that joy and feeling of freedom when you're on country and you're not being monitored, like that real absolute pleasure and joy you get when there's no white fellas around watching you.
Yeah.
In the up bush. Yeah.
It's like a matriarchal warrior woman, like this spiritual kind of shield in a way. I don't know. It just reminds me of something that's totally transcends. It feels like it is flying. So
good. I'm glad, because that was the original for it to be a kite, that like flew. And the other thing is I did some performances in that dress.
Yeah.
On the banks of the Maribyrnong here in Kulin Country. And this is when I was sort of my post-recovery from my breakdown, and I walked into the river, which I've never ever put my feet in the Maribyrnong River before, even though I was born very close to it. And because it's so polluted, it was the most beautiful, all of the accounts from local mob, and like Uncle Larry Walsh, who's a Taungurung elder, knows a lot about this area. He talks about how clean that water was. He could see straight through it, and, the mob would drink out of it before it was destroyed by colonization. Its health is okay at the moment, but it's not great. So it was it felt like I just needed to touch that water. I needed to sort of feel how cold it was. It was about June when I did it, so it was really bloody cold. But I needed to walk into it, and I was sort of trying to heal myself by connecting to country and make these physical connections of walking on place. And
it's so beautiful. There's another close-up of it here. And the feathers, there's something that it feels so like a dream. There's something about it that's so special.
I really loved it. And that dress, I was really happy when I found it, because it just really fit that idea. And there's something like quite smoky and soft in the colours as well, which I thought was unusual. I hadn't really seen. I used to collect a lot of vintage dresses, and I hadn't really seen one like that. and yeah, and then the tones of the feathers and everything just seemed to work somehow.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then it went into the Victorian Indigenous Art Awards in 2014, and it won the three-dimensional award. So I was really proud of that as well, and it just meant that I was able to sort of get those stories out there a little bit more as well.
Yeah. And when you were talking about this work, when you were talking about it the other day, when you posted an image of it, you were also talking about the Echuca Hospital and your grandmother's experience there. I don't know if you want to reflect on that or not.
Yeah. So my nan, Rosie Tang, who I mentioned before, she, was also an artist. And so I'm actually sitting in front of one of her paintings. So I've made it my background because it was very comforting during lockdown to feel like I was sitting in Nan's country, through her paintings. So she was a self-taught oil painter. And as well as, these a lot of violence that she experienced and things that she had to survive. One of them was that when she was giving birth to her children, so this is my mum's got a brother, two brothers and a sister, my auntie and uncles. One uncle's passed away, and he's one of the kids that was born on the veranda of the Echuca Hospital in the 1950s. So mum's 68 and she's the youngest. So her siblings are just a few years older than her, and they were born on the veranda of the Echuca Hospital. Mum was born somewhere else when they were living at a place called Lockhart. But when they were in town, that's where Nan was forced to give birth, as many other Aboriginal women were. So they were put into a segregated ward. And the veranda was drafty and cold in winter and very hot and uncovered in summer. And we were told that the only other women that were forced to be on the veranda were women that they described as hysterical. So they were white women who had mental health problems. And that just, when my mother told me about that, my nan never told me that directly. Like a lot of elders, she wouldn't tell me things directly like that. I would have to glean things from her in the way she would speak about something, but not directly about it. But when mum told me, I never got that image out of my mind. And also then I would think about, well, Papa, her own grandmother was an Aboriginal midwife that would assist Aboriginal women to give birth on country. And so, but by the time my nan's having her kids, they're having to live in town. So that was her experience. And I watched my nan be very afraid of hospitals and doctors as a young person, and she ended up getting breast cancer. And I remember her being so afraid of the hospital and couldn't understand why, because it was kind of drummed into us that, if you're not well, go to the hospital. Your auntie's the Aboriginal, health worker, go down there. So for me, at my generation, I didn't have the same fear, but I also couldn't understand Nan's. And it wasn't until I was told about those experiences of why she didn't trust doctors and hospitals, and the viciousness of the white nurses, just their absolute, they weren't even indifferent. They were vicious to Black women. And I remember when Nan and her sister, one of my aunties, were passing away, I remember this nurse, when she walked out of the room, because the biggest mob of us there, as in their last days and weeks, we're all visiting like you do. And I remember this white nurse walking out, and as she walked, she sort of just threw this comment over her shoulder, and she said, "Oh, these Aboriginal ladies, they just never complain. Aren't they marvelous?"
Yeah.
And it really struck me, and I thought, that's not a compliment. You're not complimenting them. You're congratulating them on not being able to express their needs, because you're not going to meet them anyway. And that's what the old girls would say. They'd go, well, no use complaining, because they knew they wouldn't. And so, and another story I was told about my great-grandmother was that a niece of hers was very sick at the Deniliquin Hospital. She had blood poisoning, and the poor darling was so thirsty. And you can imagine how dehydrated somebody gets with blood poisoning, with sepsis. She had to argue with the white nurse to let her have a glass of water, because she didn't want her to drink out of the hospital glasses because she was Black. So, that's how we carry that with us.
That internalization of that. Yeah.
Yeah. And then when I gave birth to my daughter, I was only just turned 21, to my daughter Rosie. And I remember this feeling of a complete lack of safety when I was going to give birth, and a fear. I was filled with fear and dread. And all of those kind of, when you're a kid and you get excited because you think you might have broken your arm and you want a plaster on, like other kids, you're all hypochondriac. By the time I became a teenager, that was gone. And the very reality of what the health system was like for Black women was very present for me.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, when I was in labour with my daughter, I was filled with a lot of fear. I felt very afraid and very unsure. And I know too that that's a whole other area that a lot of Aboriginal women are working on right now, about birthing rights. And the sovereignty of what we should be able to do in that, time. But so I guess that dress was a real tribute to Nan in a very personal way, but also to acknowledge the other women in our family, who were forced to be, or had no choice but to be, domestics. And Nan also worked at the Echuca laundry. And I used to think about, how she would press, the collars and the stiff white sort of collars and shirts of all the white men in town, and yet they'd look down on her and, our family. So it's that, very real stories that feel very sort of physical to me as well as spiritual. Thinking about this town and growing up in it and seeing all these traces of this history.
Yeah. And that's the work reminds me of those kind of the way memory folds in on itself and is layered and has these magical elements to it, but also how emotionally deep, how deeply you carry some of those stories, to the point where when you think you're fine, you think, oh, I'm an educated person, I'm going into this hospital, and then you feel the feeling of giving birth is relinquishing control over your body in a way. You have to kind of you're very, very vulnerable in that time, and you need to be protected but also feel strong. And when I was at Kururu, Indigenous Youth Performing Arts, that they made a film called the Road to Wallaroo, which is set on the Yorke Peninsula in South Australia. And it was because the community at Point Pearce, the women weren't allowed into the Maitland Hospital, which is the closest hospital, and so they had to drive when they were giving birth to Wallaroo, and all these babies were born on the way. So many different communities. So the film is just driving along this dirt road, and old people telling where they were born along the way, or telling the story, or if people who didn't survive as well, trying to get to and thinking about that idea of safety. I mean, referring back to what you were talking about before, I was talking to someone the other day about the kind of myth of this idea of cultural safety, because no one institution can be safe in this society if the whole society is not safe. It's an illusionary thing. You know what I mean? We don't feel safe because we're not safe. I mean, that's the reality is that there's nothing safe about our histories, about the denial of them, but also about our presence, in terms of the kind of violence that's actualized towards us. So I feel as though making these kinds of works, for me as well, when I listen to you, it's a form of kind of transformation for me of that, whatever it is, the emotion of it that I carry in me, to be able to transform it into gifts of knowledge for our children, in particular for our children. So we're educators, but ultimately my understanding of kind of education relates to that kind of intergenerational love that I was given by those women. very unjudgmental, very grounded.
Yeah.
Very, very grounded in practical survival skills of life.
Yes.
How to make a stew, how to make a beautiful garden, how to make your life out of nothing.
Yeah.
How to gather things around you and make it something very special, because who we are is special, because who we are is vital.
Yeah.
And also being proud of who you are, not denying your family, always acknowledging your family and community, and seeing people for what they've been through and having compassion and understanding. All of those kinds of values, I feel as though the art making allows me, because I was taught as well. My auntie Shiley was a self-taught artist and made prolifically, just kept making stuff, and she'd make it out of Easter egg wrappers or bits of bark and stick.
Beautiful. Yeah.
Sewing and drawing. She's always making something. And it's kind of also that idea of, I don't know, the miniature, the worlds within the world. So the joy that we have together.
Yeah. And creating those like special places of just love and joy amongst all of it. And like for me, like my nan, my mum and aunties they were the very first curators I ever knew. The way they would make their homes is just so beautiful. And I just, in my work at other times, I've recreated like my grandmother's lounge room. I'm just obsessed with their sense of, they're like, it's more than homemaking. It's like you said, it's this places of love and places of beauty and joy amongst all of it, and to value every little thing, like nothing's taken for granted. And so my mum always says, it's the little things, it's all the little things. And like, she just takes so much joy in the littlest things. Nothing's taken for granted. And I could never get over the way my grandmother would act over a piece of cake or cheesecake. It was like Christmas, and my mum would whisper to me and she'd go, they were starving when they were growing up. They were starving. They lived on bread and fat. And just that, to see like this joy that my nan would take in us kids, being able to have Christmas presents.
Yeah.
And so it's just constantly subverting these very bleak, violent spaces with just so much love, but also so much strictness too, like real firm boundaries, so that where you stand with them all the time.
Yeah.
And that kind of love is so precious, because it gives you a sense of self and a sense of whole being, making you feel whole. And also so important in your identity and your strength and your love of yourself and your people. Like you said, we get ripped if we don't say hello to people properly down the street, or, you get poked in the ribs and say, hey, it's your relation there. That knowledge and the protection of knowledge is very, very important. And, my grandmother's way of being, I really feel it as I get older. And I also have relatives that look at me and say, gee, you're getting like your grandmother in the face. And it just is so emotional, because you miss them so much. Like I miss her so much, but sort of feeling that she's here. And at a show at Tarrawarra at the moment that Stacey Piper's curated, the Willenbeck show, I put one of my grandmother's actual paintings in the show, and then I've also had it blown up into a big wallpaper, and I've created like a nan's camp. So
is that the painting behind you?
It's similar to this one. The other one's got a bit more detail in it, but
the other one's got a mountain,
got a big tree, and a little mountain range, and I'm like, I'm fangirling my nan, but it's like deadly. but it's for my kids and my grandkids and my nieces and nephews that didn't get to know her. So I'm sort of like recreating these places of love, and they see it at my mum's. My mum's is so similar. It's just full of photographs and family artifacts, and the whole home is full of culture, and it's very, very carefully curated. And I think that for me, it gives me a tool and a strategy for operating in the so-called art world. And I'm only interested in telling like unequivocally blackfellow stories in that space. I'm not ambitious as an artist in any other way. It's about making this space for these, stories. And like you said before too, because, there isn't any safe space for us. There actually isn't. And this notion of cultural safety is, like you said, it's a big farce, and it's also, a money-making venture, and it also gives people a false sense of hope. I think they're actually quite dangerous, and no one's ever really evaluated them properly. There's no, not that I've seen. I don't know of any actual outcomes. And at one point, I was participating in some. We didn't call it cultural awareness because I was over it, but we were talking about equipping people to work in Aboriginal community cultural context. And for a while, for about 2 years, we, as a group that were working on it, we felt we were doing, a good job. We felt that we might be making some impact. And then when I started to look around at all of us, we were getting sick, we were getting exhausted, we were very drained, we were being constantly hit up by the people that had done the programs with us. And I said, I don't want to do this anymore. And I actually think that if I continue doing this, I'm not serving my community properly, because what I'm seeing is, and what I'm hearing is, that Aboriginal women in particular are saying in workplaces it's actually made things worse, because it's inadvertently empowering white people to become even more opinionated about us. It wasn't actually changing anything. So I'm just absolutely advocating for an anti-racism.
Yeah. That anti-racism has to be at the core.
It has to be anti-racist, and it has to be a Black Aboriginal critical race theory in this country that people engage in, and just go and do that. Like, before you even attempt to learn anything about us, please go and do that. Work on yourself.
I mean, and I was thinking about that whole, they talk about it as implicit bias, or they talk about it, or however you want to frame it. It's kind of like the racism that people have to experience that's so ingrained in all of the institutional spaces that, it has to be purged everywhere. You can't have it around, so you can't say particular spaces can be safe, because they can't in this context.
No, it's not possible. And the way that our art is either like used or consumed is it can be really problematic. So there's just a care to be taken, I think, with how we do this work. And I think this is why shows like yours, and to be a part of Tanand, is just, it's so it feels very nourishing for me. And especially being over here, on Kulin Country, away from you fellas as well, it's very nourishing for me. It feels like that I'm part of a national story, that, we're talking about this, and, remembering, all those old girls and what they did for all of us. Yeah.
Thank you, Paola. I just wanted to acknowledge this mock cooking show, this one, and this one, Washing Day Sis, and just to acknowledge the kind of humour as well.
Thank you.
The love, the humour. But
I just added those in addition to the work in your show, just to sort of, there's some other ways that I'm doing this work about just talking about that the labour history of our bodies. Yeah.
So this idea of emotional labour, physical labour, the labour of our histories, the labour of, but also the love, the joy, the celebration, wanting to teach our kids about survival, because, I used to think when I was younger, I don't want, I felt really arrogant about survival, but the older I've gotten and the more people that I've lost who I grew up with on the way, I'm really interested in survival, but also kind of like writing as revenge and making artwork as a form of revenge.
Yes.
And I get a particular kind of joy out of thinking about intergenerational cruelty, and that I can seek revenge on the perpetrators of some of my nanas. The crimes against my nanas can be laid out in artworks, and Eve Tuck talks about it. She wants to put it back on the table. I think it's really important for us to kind of feel as though we can hold people accountable you know, or the society accountable. And I guess that fuels some of the work because, you know, I don't want to get pickled in my own anger. We're all about love, us unbound women. And
yes.
so we were thinking about how do we transform it, honey?
Yeah.
So that's deadly because, you know, they're important conversations. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Sis. It's just so lovely. And I look forward to the day when I can catch up with you face to face in the real life.
Me too. Can't wait.
Yeah. And thanks everyone for listening to our yarn, our little artist talk on the beautiful Paola Balla and her amazing work. Go and see Willem Bick, which means country, doesn't it? Is that
home country? Yeah, home country in Woiwurrung language of the Wurundjeri peoples.
Okay, and it's at Tarawara at the moment. All right. Yeah. Thank you, my deadly, and I will speak to you soon.
Thank you, sis.
Thank you, and thank you to Bree and Maddie and all the FUMA team for helping set this up.
Thanks everyone for having me. Thank you.
See ya.
See ya.
Bye.